This has been my biggest project ever. I set out to create a tabletop version of the entire Johto region from Pokemon, and I'm going to show you exactly how I took this idea from a thought to a reality. So how do you start a project like this? Well, same way you eat an elephant, or a Donphan, I guess. One bite at a time. For me, that first bite was trying to determine how big to make everything and how much detail I could capture. I started by printing a house and a tree in the size that I thought would work, just kind of guessing. And then I went into a new SolidWorks file to see how big that would actually make everything. So the Johto region is made on a tile-based map system that can stitch together almost perfectly, with a few outliers that I'll point out later. But I found this map online of every single route and town stitched together and used it as my base. I had to count the individual tiles across the entirety of Johto and use real measurements to define the size of each player-sized tile. If you're curious, the entire Johto region, from the eastern edge of New Barktown to the western side of Cianwood, is 544 player-sized tiles wide. The north-south length is a little bit more ambiguous, just depending on where you set your bounds, but I chose a length of 408 tiles. Because I wanted the map to be slightly larger than 48 by 36 inches, which is a standard size for a glass tabletop, I set each tile to be 2.25 millimeters squared. And I know two different measurement systems, but I'm used to using metric in SolidWorks, and I'm used to using imperial for woodworking, so it is what it is. This meant that the building and tree I showed you before are just over double the size that they should be. So here are the actual sizes that they need to be to fit within that 48 by 36 rectangle boundary that I've chosen. Next, I wanted to test an idea of attaching trees to the ground. I imagined a sort of pegboard shown here, but this did not work because of how tiny the trees were. And I also realized it would be a nightmare to attach every single tree individually. So on to the next idea. Before I get there though, I had to design the piece that the trees would sit on. To do that, I created a sketch on top of the picture, covering exactly where the trees go, where the ledges are, where the water is, and where the paths are. I broke up the area into 12 306 by 306 millimeter squares, because that's close to the maximum size my printer can handle. You can see that my sketch goes outside of the bounds of the game area. That's because I had to fill in all that white space somehow. I mean, how silly would it look if the map only included the game areas and a bunch of white space? I actually had a lot of fun deciding what these in-between areas looked like. Most are pretty simple compared to the towns and routes, but it was like adding my own piece into something I love. I used this picture of Johto to create a rough shape of the entire area, though I did stick to the tile-based system to keep everything looking consistent. Once my sketch was complete, I could begin extruding the sketch into something 3D, and after many steps I arrived at this, the first of the 12 panels to be printed, which was met with an immediate print failure. I mean, kinda close to done, but that edge curled up. But after that, I got my settings dialed in perfectly and got every panel printed. And here's how they look all printed out. One limitation I want to bring up is that my printer can only print in 4 colors at once. You could see on a previous piece that I had green, blue, tan, and a sand color. This one you can see that green has been changed to a gray. Now there are pieces of the map that have 5 colors, like this one here, just north. You can see the northern 2 Whirl Islands here, Olivine City, and the Safari Zone. To get around this, I was able to print some extra pieces to fit into the map to include those green, gray, and even red sections here. So here's our first look at all the pieces assembled. And you'll notice I dropped in my extra color pieces for Ecruteak up here, Violet City here, and Goldenrod City here that didn't come with the original prints, as well as the Olivine and the Safari Zone that I mentioned earlier. The next thing that I had to consider was the water. Especially apparent on this piece here is how boring it looks with just flat blue nothingness. So in the game, there's a pattern on the water and it moves. So what I wanted to do is try and replicate that. And like I mentioned earlier, I could only print in 4 colors, so I couldn't put a white pattern over this. So I printed a separate mesh to go over this. This is replicated 1-to-1 from the game, but it's an extremely fragile mesh. And you can see here, there's a bit of inconsistency on how it's printed. And also, I think it just takes away from the water. There's a bit too much there. It's a little overbearing. Even though it's scaled to the game, it just doesn't look that good in a real life scenario. So my next option was making something a little bit bigger. Upping the pattern here creates something that looks a lot better. You still have that pattern from the game, but it's not overbearing. There's not too much white on that blue, so I decided to go with this. So now that I've shown you the panels, I want to get back to the trees. You can see here the full map with no trees on it, but everything is done aside from that. So I'm going to go ahead and hide 11 of these 12 panels and just focus on this top left piece here. So everywhere the tree should be, which is the majority of this section, has a separate body, which is just a solid model separate from the main base plate. You can see here that I've highlighted each of those, and I'm going to pull those into a separate file so I can avoid seeing the map beneath, and I can avoid putting trees directly onto the panel. Now that I have these in another piece, I'm going to drop them into an assembly. An assembly is a part file that allows you to combine multiple 3D object files, and that's what I need to combine the tree model with these base plate models. Also adding a little color just so my 3D model looks nice. Alright, now I can just put everything into this assembly and drop in the actual tree part, which I built as an individual model. Basically that thing that you saw I printed at the very beginning, a tiny, tiny little model. So you can see here that I've dropped one in. Now these panels are actually at different heights, so I need to drop one in for each height level, just so I can pattern them well and copy them onto each one of these. The next thing that I need to do is actually mate these trees to the panels. What that means is just constraining where the tree is in relation to the panel. I can do this by using a sketch within the tree model. By clicking on a certain edge within one model and a certain edge on another, I can lock it down. As long as you lock it down from a couple different angles, the tree will be locked in place. Now that my trees are locked in place, what I can do is called a linear pattern, where basically you take one object and multiply it in 2 directions to form a giant grid of the object you want. In this case, this little tree here. You can see here that they'll pop up in yellow, and as I type in the amount I want, you'll see a ton of them pop up in a line, and then I'll fill out my second dimension and you'll see even more pop up into a grid. It's the wrong direction, so I flip it. And what you'll notice here is I only want trees on this one little section, but it's showing these yellow ghost trees everywhere else. What I can actually do here is go in and deselect the trees that I don't want using these little pink dots here. Luckily you can just drag and grab. You don't have to click them all individually, but I'm going to go through here and get rid of all the ones I don't want and then accept the pattern. And voila! We have all the trees on one singular panel. Now I just need to do that for every single individual tree area in the entire game. So before printing the trees, I had to make sure they would actually fit into the map. What I mean by that is when you're printing things with a 3D printer, you cannot actually print a 90-degree angle. Everything will have a slight radius on it. So a corner you see here is not actually 90 degrees. And that's especially a problem on complex areas like this. So what I did is print a couple different tree models with different tolerances, starting all the way from 0.4 millimeters, which has a bit of a loose fit there, you can see. up to 0.3, 0.2, and finally 0.1 millimeter between the shape of the tree and the shape of the land. And that actually fits perfectly, so that's what I decided to go with. So that means I have to jump back into my tree models and trim 0.1 millimeter off the outside edge of every single one of these panels, which is what I'm doing right here. But now's where I get to print them. So what I'm doing here is I'm bringing in my tree models to my slicer. What that does is it creates layers for the 3D printer to follow. What you can do in this software is choose where you want things to be colored, which is what I'm gonna do here. The ground's gonna be this bluish greenish color, the trunks will be brown, and the trees will be green, and then I'll send it off to print. So the trees look really nice from a distance, but if you get up close, you notice an issue. You can see between the trees, there's a bit of stringiness connecting these trees here, and it looks even worse in person. The solution to this is a heat gun. When you apply heat to stringy bits of plastic, it'll curl up and you won't see those anymore. Imagine holding a plastic fork over a fire or a candle, how it curls up. That's the same thing that happens here, and you can make parts look much better using a heat gun on them. The next thing for me to consider was grass. So I started off by printing a couple pieces with a pattern that I thought would look all right and a color I thought would look all right. I wanted something that was different than the small grass and different than the trees. So I printed these pieces here, and you can see the pattern is, it's all right, but I didn't love it. It just looks like a bunch of squares. So I decided to print something that was a little more varied. You can see here, this looks a little bit spikier, a little bit more natural when compared to this piece here. It just looks overall better. So the next thing to consider was how this looks against the small grass. It looks okay, there's a bit of variation there. And then how it looked with the trees in place. And I just didn't like it. I don't like how this green looks with these other two together. So the next thing for me to consider was what color. And I didn't like the lighter, so I decided to go with something a little darker, which is this piece here. And personally, I think that looks much better with these trees and this small grass than this one does. So that's what I decided to go with. Well, that's everything built, so let's put it all together. Let there be trees. If only it were that easy. When I did that, actually, that was an extra tree piece, and trees went everywhere. I'm still finding them, they're everywhere. But I started gluing the trees on. I'm using super glue here on some, Elmer's glue on the other, because I actually ran out of super glue and had to go get more halfway through this process. But it took a long time to get these together, because even with that 0.1 tolerance that I figured out earlier, some of these did not quite fit perfectly. It's a little hard to tell with some of these sped up, but I did have to jam some of these trees into place, using some tools sometimes to actually get them exactly where they needed to be, sitting within their little pockets that they're meant to fit in. But after a while, I was able to get everything glued in place perfectly, and I'll show you in a second exactly what that looks like. Alright, here's the whole map with trees put on. So let's do the same thing with grass. Oh my gosh, it worked this time. I must have just done something wrong with the trees, right? That definitely didn't take hours of work to get all this glued in place. But anyway, everything looks awesome with the grass and the trees on, so I cannot wait to add these buildings. With the trees, the water, and the grass all done, the last thing to consider was buildings. Now, these things are tiny. I mean, this is the size of my hand against this piece. So the buildings are super tiny. The first one I designed was the route change building. This sits in between some routes and towns in the game, and you can see that this thing fits on the tip of my finger. Now, the details are small enough in these that the 4-color restriction was not at all an issue. And the first buildings I did after that were New Bark Town. So this is Professor Elm's lab, and you can see again how tiny those details are. This is my finger and that is the building, but these fit perfectly within the scale of the map. Next was the Pokemon Center and the Pokemart. and I'm especially happy with how these turned out with the tiny little details in there. Unfortunately, I couldn't actually make the Pokemon sign on that little white top there because that was just way too tiny. The Pokemon turned out just as well with those black little stripes, looking great. I want to show one example of how I make a building. So in this case for the fountain, I'm just going to start by drawing a circle, extruding it out to a cylinder, taking a little cut out of that, adding a cone in the center, and then I'll add another cylinder up here for the little upper bath of the fountain. Hollow it out a little, add another cylinder, and then just color things blue. And that's pretty much it because the scale is so small that you don't need to capture much detail. So after printing hundreds of buildings with hundreds of spares, I got to work gluing them on, which means you get to see another 8 hours of work in less than a minute. I went through the rest of my second bottle of super glue here and had to go back to the old Elmers. But gluing on these buildings were not the most tedious process. I'm about to show you the coolest piece of this map, into which I put the most effort and time. Bellchime Trail is my favorite area in the entirety of Heartgold and Soulsilver. You can just tell how much care and attention was put into this small area that you only even visit one time. I wanted to put an equal amount of care into this spot since it blew me away as a kid. I printed out a couple different colors of trees so that I could mimic that fall-like color scheme of the in-game area. I had to manually cut and place each individual color tree into its spot, which took forever. But the final result made all of that hard work worth it. While I have you here, I just want to thank you for watching the video this far. I put a ton into this project. I'm going to do a price breakdown at the end, and I don't even want to know how much time I spent on this. But it's my first time making a video like this, so even if a single person watches the entire video, I'll be happy. I'd love to know what you think of my process and if you have any tips to make better videos going forward, because this will not be my last. Anyway, here is the finished Bellchime Trail. It came together really well and looks even better when it's slotted into the full map, which you'll get to see later. This is where I leave my area of expertise. I've done a little bit of woodworking in my life, but mostly just for stage design, meaning it doesn't really have to look that good since it's not being seen up close. It just has to be sturdy. This is a little different than that since it will be seen very up close. All that to say, my techniques here may not be the best or the safest ones, so I don't really recommend copying them exactly as I've done them. And looking back, I really could have benefited from a second set of hands helping me on some of this. The first step here was to cut the piece of plywood on which the printed pieces will sit. The design of the table allows me to remove the piece that the map sits on in case I ever want to do anything different with it. The only thing that actually holds the map onto the table is just going to be gravity. After the cut, I had to sand the plywood so that it doesn't give me any splinters. It's not the highest quality piece of wood, and so that I can get a nice coat of stain on it. I did my best to get it smooth, but it wasn't perfect. The next step was staining. I picked up a color I liked at Home Depot and got to work. I didn't include all the footage because it's really long, but I did do 2 coats of stain on both sides of the plywood. It won't really be seen unless you look at the table from underneath, but I still wanted it to look nice on the other side. After the stain was done drying, I could attach all the panels to the plywood. I spent a ridiculous amount of time making sure everything lined up perfectly and clamping it all down. Once everything was held securely in place by clamps, I could lift each panel one by one, glue it down, and then put the clamps back on. Alright, so with that drawing, I mentioned I have a few pieces that actually fit in between the seams, so I'm going to go ahead and put those on now while this is drying. The very last thing to attach to the map was the water pattern. This one was tough because it's not as simple as applying glue to the bottom like I did for the grass or the trees or the buildings. It's so tiny that I had to get some spray glue to do it. Once I sprayed the bottom of the pattern while trying to prevent the wind from blowing it away, I could bring it inside and carefully put it in place. The edges were pretty finicky since the glued surface area is very small. It took a little bit of extra spraying to get everything held down properly, and a lot of tapping in place. After all the work, the final result looked something like a finished product. Everything glued on together looked great. With the map piece done, I could get to work on cutting the boards for the rest of the table. And you know what they say, measure twice, cut once. There are 3 stages of the table assembly, each made up of 4 boards. The top section is made up of 1x6 boards ripped in half and cut at 45-degree angles. This means I had 12 straight cuts, 8 angled cuts, and 4 boards to split in half, all measured precisely to ensure a proper fit. Splitting the 1x6 boards into 1x3 boards for the top of the table was a last-minute design change that I actually made while I was already cutting the boards for the bottom of the table. I had played around with the sizes of the boards that I wanted to use for each piece of the table, but ultimately ended up using the 1x4s for the base and the sides, and the 1x3s for the top. Alright, so we got the first part of our frame here. This is what the map's actually going to sit on top of on that sheet of plywood. So, next thing to do is glue it together before I sand it and paint it. Alright, it's been a day, let's see how this thing looks. I didn't get it on video, but had a new method of putting this thing together. Found this strap here, pretty similar to my idea, but just executed better. It has these corner pieces, and you ratchet it all together so it holds something in a rectangle. So, let's get this actually turned out well. Alright, look at that. Now that I had the base put together, I could go ahead and lay the map down on the base to make sure things were actually, lining up the way I wanted them to. Started to lay the boards around the outside of the map, and I actually spent a minute here trying to get these labels off that came on, and I eventually just decided I'd have to take them off during sanding. I could not, for the life of me, get these things off with my nails, but I gave up. Went ahead and attached these boards on the side, and got to work gluing them in place. You'll notice that I'm not using any screws on this table, just wood glue. The main reason for that is I didn't want to risk splitting the wood by putting a screw into its thinnest side. Even if I didn't split the wood, the risk of having the angle slightly off and poking a screw through the wood was too high. I also didn't want any visible screws on the outside of the table, so that played into it as well. Wood glue is actually stronger than screws anyway once it's dried, so having a way to hold it in place while it dried negated my need to use any screws at all. Alright, my next step is attaching these boards here. My problem though is I only have 2 of these clamps, so I've kind of rigged up a little system here to hold the side boards in place while I glue the long boards. Then I'm going to unclamp these and glue on the shorter pieces. I wish I had more of those because I could glue this all in one day, but I'm just going to have to roll with this. With my rigged up brick system, I got to work gluing on the top boards. I mentioned earlier that I could have benefited from a second set of hands, but I could have benefited more from a second set of clamps. I was already too deep in this project financially though to buy any more, and more importantly, I did not want to make a 4th trip to Home Depot. This worked out alright though. I was able to get all the glued pieces on over the course of 2 days, so that I could allow each piece to fully dry while clamped. Once everything was done drying, it was time to repeat the same process that I did with the plywood. First was sanding the table. The boards are poplar, much higher quality than the plywood, so I was able to get the table very smooth before staining. I also sanded all of the corners to make sure everything lined up perfectly, and all of the joints to make sure they were perfectly flat. After all the sanding, it was time to stain. Because of the shape of the table, I had to use a combination of a brush and a roller to get everything covered well. I started with the top of the table, getting 2 coats done, and then flipped it over to get 2 more coats on the bottom. Alright, here it is. Fully stained. Now, just gotta wait for those legs. Alright, my legs finally arrived. This box looks like it's been through the ringer. Alright, look at that, there they are. 4 of those. We'll put the table perfect workspace. It's gonna go right here. Let's get it together. Okay, I lied about no screws earlier. What I meant was no screws to hold the wood together. I did end up making a fifth trip to Home Depot to get screws because the ones that came with the legs were too long, and they would have poked through the bottom of the table into that plywood. I measured out all of the holes, marked them with a Sharpie, drilled them out, being very careful not to poke through the bottom of the table, and then screwed them all into place. That last angle wasn't too great, so I'm giving you another look here. It is looking good. Very happy with that. Check that out. All right, just got home from work. My glass arrived, so let's cut this bad boy open. It's way heavier than I thought it would be. Ooh. Look at that, that's so nice. Oh yeah. Oh, that has me excited. Let's get that on there. All right, so my plan for getting the glass onto the wood is by using these little metal pegs here. So I got these, they're meant for a glass shelf. I'm gonna put these in the wood and the glass is gonna sit on top. So the tricky part is making sure that the glass actually sits flush with the top of the wood here. So my plan for that is this little guy right here. So this is something that I just pulled off the printer. It's going to allow me to butt up against the wood, drill through this hole. It's actually measured to be the correct depth so that I drill in the exact right amount into the wood, and hopefully the glass will sit flush with that. The tricky part is this little rubber thing compresses a tiny bit, but I don't know exactly how much. So I might have to adjust the height on this. Right now I gave it about a 1/16 of an inch once compressed, so we'll see if that works. I'm gonna use this test piece here and see if it works. Let's see how this thing does here. I'm just gonna use the weight here to prop this up. Let's see. All right, I mean, that is actually pretty good. Did I just get that right on the first try? I mean, could be a little bit higher, but I already drilled some of these because I wanted to make sure it worked. But here's what it looks like when I use that little plastic piece I printed. This is actually a second version. I wanted to make the glass perfectly flush since my first piece was just a little bit off in that first clip. So this is V2. Well, the last edition of the train track, the magnet rail that goes to Kanto, the map's pretty much done. Except for that big blank section over there. For that, I've saved one of my favorite pieces. One of the most iconic areas from this game. The peak of Mount Silver, where you face off against Red, the protagonist from the original games. So that fits right over here. And that's it. The map is complete, so it's time to drop it into the table. As with most parts of this project, easier said than done. There is absolutely no wiggle room between the map and the walls because of the way I measured the wood, which means it has to be dropped in perfectly. I had to go under the table to keep it flat. Even then, I had to use a rubber mallet to tap the corners into place. So it isn't really a problem that it's only gravity holding it in place. It's pretty tight in there. The final piece is the glass to cover everything up. I lifted it on, slid it into place, and lowered it as carefully as I could. But with that, the project is complete. Alright, before for the grand reveal, I did promise a price breakdown. So here's my total bill of materials and each material's associated cost. The entire thing is just made of wood, filament, and a few miscellaneous items to tie it all together. I didn't include things that I already had, like wood glue or tools or super glue. So here are the quantities of each item. And I will say I didn't use 100% of every roll of filament. Far from it, actually. So I could stand to shave over $100 worth of filament off of the actual build cost, but it's still money gone from my account, so I decided to include it. So here's the price of each line item. Okay, getting a little scary now. And boom, here it is. The grand price reveal, $839. Kind of blown away by this. I actually am just putting all these numbers together for the first time. The glass really killed me here, but I guess that's the price of a one-of-a-kind object like this, which I'm sure you're really eager to see if you watched this far. So, here it is. Well, what do you think? I hope you're impressed by the results, because it took a lot of hard work to get here, and I'm personally very happy with it, especially with Bellchime Trail and Mount Silver, where I put a little bit of extra effort in. I'd love to hear any questions or thoughts in the comments, as well as what you think my next major project should be. But that's all I got for you, so thank you for watching until the end. If you'd like to support my future projects, please subscribe to the channel and share with your friends. I'll see you on the next video.